Hello and welcome to What's Past is Prologue. My name is Daniel and this is my channel that is dedicated to the book series The Story of Civilization by Will and Ariel Durant. In this video I'm going to talk a little bit about what the book series is about, then I'm going to talk about who the Durants were, and then I'm going to tell you what you can expect from this channel going forward. So what is The Story of Civilization? What are these books about? Well, they are an 11-volume work of history. They start in human prehistory and then they go through 60 centuries all the way to the Napoleonic period. They're about 4 million words long. They are 10,000 pages. They are 340 chapters. The Durants started working on them in the 1920s. The first volume was published in 1935, and the last volume was published in 1975. So this was a 40-year work for the Durants, and it is their magnum opus. Who were the Durants? So Will Durant was born in Massachusetts in 1885, and his wife Ariel was born in what was at that point the Russian Empire in 1898. It is today Ukraine. She emigrated to the United States and they were married in 1913. After they were married, Will Durant started working on a book that would become known as The Story of Philosophy, which helped to popularize philosophical ideas for ordinary people, for like the masses. After that book came out, it was a fairly major financial success. They used that money to travel the world, and they traveled around the world twice, and they began to collect information for a future work which would become known as The Story of Civilization. At first, it was primarily Will Durant that was writing, and he wrote the first 6 books and is credited as being the author. And in the 7th book, because Ariel had been doing so much work with him, she became the co-author with him. So it became Will and Ariel Durant's The Story of Civilization. So that was from The Age of Reason Begins, volume 7, onto the last volume, volume 11. These books were very successful, and they were both commercially successful, also critically successful. So in 1968, the Durants jointly won the Pulitzer Prize for the 10th volume, that being the volume Rousseau and Revolution. The Durants were an inseparable couple. When they first met, Will Durant nicknamed his wife Ariel. He did this after the fairy stroke pixie stroke spirit in Shakespeare's play The Tempest. I mention this because this channel is called What's Past is Prologue, which some people might know is actually also a quote from The Tempest. And so the channel name works on 3 different levels. One is a callback to Ariel and The Tempest and the Durants. Secondly, the idea of What's Past is Prologue is that the past has an effect on the present, and it's also the inverse, right? The What's Past is Prologue is What's Past is merely prologue, so it doesn't have an effect on the present. So the channel name works in 3 different ways, which is why I quite like it. Anyway, the Durants were married and lived together for 67 years, so it's quite a long relationship and quite a successful relationship. They were so closely attached to each other that when Will Durant fell ill in 1981 and was taken to hospital, Ariel stopped eating, and she soon fell ill and died. And when Will found out about this, he also pretty much gave up the will to live, and so they actually died within 2 weeks of each other in 1981. It's kind of a sad and slightly romantic way of going out, I think. And they're buried side by side in Los Angeles. Anyway, so as I said earlier on, there are 340 chapters in The Story of Civilization, and it goes over 11 volumes. And I thought I would just give you a very, very brief overview of what these 11 volumes are about. And I want to emphasize that this is just scratching the surface. There's a lot in these volumes, but just a brief overview of each volume. So the first volume is Our Oriental Heritage, which goes from human prehistory all the way to the 1930s. and it focuses on what we would today think of as the Middle East and Asia more broadly. It covers Egyptian civilization. It covers the Sumerians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Hittites, the Phoenicians. It goes further east and covers civilization in India and in China and in Japan. It's very different from the other volumes because most of the other volumes are focused on civilization in Europe or North Africa or in the Middle East, whereas the first volume goes all the way over to East Asia, all the way over to Japan. So it's distinct, and there are specific reasons why the first volume is distinct, which I'll talk about in the next video. So the second volume, The Life of Greece, covers Greek civilization, ancient Greek civilization. So it goes from the Minoans and the Mycenaeans, and then it goes through the Greek Dark Ages. It covers archaic Greece, and then classical Greece, and then the Hellenistic period. So it's a broad sweep of ancient Greek history. The third volume, Caesar and Christ, covers, first of all, it begins with the Etruscans, and then it goes into the Roman Republic, and then it goes into the Roman Imperial period, and it goes up to about 300 AD. It also covers the first 3 centuries of the beginnings of Christianity and the early phases of Christianity. So that's covered in the third volume. The fourth volume, The Age of Faith, is the largest of the 11 volumes. It covers about 1,000 years of history from 300 AD all the way to 1300 AD. It covers things like the Byzantine, Eastern Roman Empire, Charlemagne, the Normans, the development of science during the Middle Ages, culture during the Middle Ages, the development of the Catholic Church over about 1,000 years. So it's quite an extensive volume. It's quite a good volume, actually. The fifth volume, The Renaissance, covers 250 years from 1300 to 1550, and it focuses almost entirely on the Italian Renaissance. So we don't really get very much about the Renaissance in France or in Germany or in England. Instead, it goes from Petrarch all the way to the death of Titian. And it covers the kinds of people that you traditionally associate with the Renaissance, so Michelangelo, Leonardo, Raphael, people like that. But it also focuses more generally on humanism and the transfer of knowledge from the declining Eastern Byzantine Roman Empire to Italy. So when the Byzantine Empire began to collapse, people fled Constantinople and came to Italy, and they brought with them some of the ideas and some of the information, some of the knowledge they had about classical antiquity. So as I say, it's about 250 years, almost entirely focused on Italy, and that is volume 5 of the Renaissance. The sixth volume, The Reformation, continues where the Age of Faith ended. So we pick up at 1300, but we go around the rest of Europe. So we have a look at the Reformation in France, the Reformation in England, the Reformation in Germany, and it focuses on the kinds of people that you would think would be prominent in this particular period. So Martin Luther, Calvin, people like Erasmus. And there's a section on Henry VIII and the Reformation in England, and there's a section on religious wars, and there's a section on the Counter-Reformation. So that's about 250 years from 1300 to roughly 1550, 1560, and that's volume number 6, The Reformation. The seventh volume, The Age of Reason Begins, covers about 60, 70 years, the last couple of decades of the 16th century and the first 50 years of the 17th century. That's really what it focuses on, that first 50 years of the 17th century. So it begins with Elizabeth I and it ends with Descartes. And the kinds of people that are prominent in this volume are, so Shakespeare is covered extensively in this volume, as is Henry IV of France, Good King Henry, and Philip II of Spain. The Dutch Revolt is covered in this period, in this particular volume. So yeah, it's mostly focused on, The Age of Reason Begins is mostly focused on the first 50 years of the 17th century. The eighth volume, The Age of Louis XIV, follows the eponymous Louis from 1649, when I think he was coronated in 1649, till 1715. So it covers that 65, 66 year reign, maybe a bit longer, of Louis XIV. And you see the culturally significant figures in and around the court of Louis XIV. So all of the various things that Louis was up to, plus people like Racine and Molière. The volume really heavily focuses on England and France. So it shifts back and forth between France and England. And so after you've been to the court of Louis XIV, it goes over to look at the execution of Charles I and the interregnum and the Cromwellian period, as well as people like Milton are covered. It then focuses on the philosophically interesting people of the time, so people like Spinoza and Hobbes, and then it kind of ends with a discussion about Newton and how influential Newton was to science in that particular period, and how influential Newton has been kind of ever since, really. So that's the 8th volume, The Age of Louis XIV. So roughly from 1650-ish to 1715. The 8th volume. The 9th volume, The Age of Voltaire, is, I think, the best volume, and it covers about 40 years in roughly the first half of the 18th century. It goes from 1715 roughly to 1755, 56. Durant does something very different with this volume in that he uses Voltaire as a kind of literary device. So as Voltaire travels around Europe, we follow him around Europe, and he talks about Voltaire, but he also talks about the various countries that Voltaire visits, and Voltaire traveled extensively. So, we see Voltaire in Switzerland, we see him in France, we see him in England, we see him in Prussia, and as he goes, he talks about the various figures who are prominent in these countries. So he talks about, when he goes to Hanoverian England, he talks about Handel, and he talks about literary figures like Fielding and Richardson and Smollett. And then he he talks about Scotland and the Scottish Enlightenment. And there we talk about people like Horace Walpole, and I don't think Horace Walpole was part of the Scottish Enlightenment, but he talks about Adam Smith and David Hume. And then when we get to Prussia, he talks about Frederick the Great. And then he comes back to France, and we get a discussion about Diderot and the Philosophe and the Encyclopédie. So the 9th volume covers about 40 years from 1715 to 1755-56 in the first half of the 18th century. My cat has decided to join us, so you might be able to hear him purring in the background, but don't worry about that. Where were we? We were talking about the volume. So the 10th volume, Rousseau and Revolution, picks up where Voltaire left off, so the middle of the 18th century, and it goes not quite through the 18th century. It goes all the way till the French Revolution in 1789. So the kinds of things that are covered in this volume are, he starts by going back to Prussia and talking about the 7 Years' War and talking about Maria Theresa and Frederick the Great. There's a section on one of the many kind of tragic partitions of Poland. There's a section on Immanuel Kant. There's a section on Mozart. Music becomes more and more prominent as the volumes go on. Then he travels back over to England, and he talks about the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, very early phase of the Industrial Revolution. And then he talks about some of the literary figures of that period. So obviously there's a big section on Samuel Johnson, and there's a big section on his Bosworth. And then he goes back to France, and he's keen to wrap up civilization by taking us to the Bastille, but people storm the Bastille, and there's one more volume to come. And so we get to the 11th and final volume of the series, which is The Age of Napoleon. The Age of Napoleon actually doesn't begin with Napoleon. It begins with the aftermath of the storming of the Bastille, and the French Revolution and some of the things that the French revolutionaries did, some of the changes they made in France and the effects of the French Revolution. And then we see the reaction to the French Revolution from the rest of Europe. And then we see the campaigns of Napoleon are covered. So, Napoleon in Toulon and Napoleon in Italy and Napoleon in Egypt. And then Napoleon comes back and his gradual ascent all the way to the level of emperor. And then we see some of the changes that Napoleon makes in France. So things like the Napoleonic Code are covered extensively in the volume. And then the volume goes back over to England, where we see discussions of some of the what life was like under the Regency, and we see discussion of the Romantic poets, so people like Coleridge and Wordsworth and Byron are covered quite extensively. And then we go back over to Germany, and there's discussion about Beethoven and his significance in terms of the history of music and some of the other changes that are taking place during this period. And then we follow Napoleon as he marches off to Russia and loses and then comes back and is ultimately exiled to Elba and then comes back again. And then the volume ends with Waterloo and some of its aftermath. And so we go from 1789 to 1815. And really this was going to be the end of the series, but the Durants had planned to do a possible Age of Darwin and an Age of Einstein, but they never quite got there because it was such a large project that they never quite finished it. So that's the 11 volumes. I want to emphasize that even though I've talked about those 11 volumes, that is just scratching the surface. There is tons of information and tons of material that I didn't mention at all. I probably didn't mention 99% of the stuff that's in these volumes in terms of the subject matters. And so it's a very brief skimming of the volumes. You may ask, why am I covering this particular book series? And there are basically three answers to that. The first one is, this is a general history, and we don't really get a lot of general histories anymore. History is very much specialized now. Like, historians will focus on one particular period of history over another, or they'll focus on a particular type of history, the economic history of France from, 1825 to 1845 or something. And that's interesting, and that's good, but I wanted a general history. I wanted a kind of sweeping epic of history, and this series very much achieves that. The second reason is there's just tons of information that isn't normally covered in when people talk about history. They tend to talk about the political and military campaigns of history, but they don't talk so much about the cultural achievements. We don't get a lot about the history of poetry or the history of literature generally, or the history of sculpture or the history of painting or the history of philosophy. These things are kind of not focused on to the same degree, and Durant really covers them all really well. So I think it was just the amount of information that is kind of not really talked about as much in these volumes. And the third reason is because it's my favorite series, and if I want to cover my favorite series, I'm going to cover my favorite series. I don't need a reason really. So yeah, those are the three reasons. My original idea actually wasn't to cover civilization at all. My original idea was to cover The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire by Edward Gibbon. But when I Googled it, I found that someone was already covering Gibbon. They were going through Gibbon section by section, and I thought, well, if they're already doing it, I'm not going to do it too. So I didn't find anyone talking about civilization in the way that I want to talk about it. So what can you expect from this channel? What am I going to do with these books, with this book series? So there are, as I say, 340 chapters, and each of these chapters are broken down into different sections in the book. And so there's about 2,400 sections of the book, and I intend to go systematically through every section. And I intend to make a video about every section, and I'm going to try and make a video every week about a section, and we'll see how I get on. I think it's going to be quite a vast project to cover, but I'm going to try. I'm going to start with volume 1. I'm going to start with our Oriental heritage. I'm going to start in human prehistory, and I'm going to see what Durant says about that, and I'm going to try and go all the way to the Napoleonic period. It will probably take years for me to do this, but I'm going to try. If you would like to follow along with me, that would be pretty cool. The Story of Civilization is available pretty much everywhere. So I'm just going to list some different places you can find it. First of all, the Story of Civilization is available in your local library. So if you want to go and get some copies, they'll be in the library. You can also find PDFs and Audible copies of Civilization on the Internet Archive. That's available. You can just download the PDFs. There is Audible, as in like Amazon's Audible audio versions available that you can buy, and it is you can find the physical copies of the books on Amazon and on eBay. So there's also like Audible versions on YouTube. I'm not really sure what the copyright status of that is, but that's not my problem. The first thing I'm going to cover in the next video is I'm going to cover the preface to Volume 1. So Our Oriental Heritage. So the first volume, the preface. I'm just going to talk about the preface. It's like maybe a couple of pages, 2-3 pages. That's what I'm going to focus on in the next video. So if you want to follow along, that would be good. And if you made it all the way to the end of this video, I would be surprised. But thank you for watching. Have a great day.